Thanks for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this.
Me too. So you've been a writer for a long time. When did you begin writing?
You know, I started writing in college. I think like most people, I had a lot of term papers to write, but I also took some creative writing classes. And then I went on to graduate school and did more writing and then more writing. And by the time I started my career, I was doing a lot of different types of writing. So technical writing, analytical writing, persuasive writing, all of those things kind of made for what really developed into a career in public health for me.
And can you talk about that, your professional career?
So I've worked in public health in Maine since about 2000, and most of the time that work has been focused on substance use issues. So working on preventing kids from starting, working on different treatment modalities, making sure that the types of treatment we need are available. And then most recently, engaging the recovery community in finding out what they need for support and figuring out how to make that happen.
And for a long time it's been articles. You've written a number of articles for magazines.
I write primarily for Journey magazine, which is it's a magazine for people to learn about recovery, to sort of shine a light on hope, the hope of recovery. So one of the articles I wrote recently, actually, is about recovery residences, and that article talks about, well, what is a recovery residence, and how do I find one, and what happens if you're in one, and how much do they cost, and where are they in Maine? So for people who are looking for some transitional housing, maybe they're coming out of treatment, maybe they're coming out of jail, and they need a place to live, to sort of develop some life skills and get ready to live independently. That's what recovery residences are for. And so that's one of the articles that I wrote for Journey magazine.
Interesting, and a number of other ones I see
That's
too.
right, yeah.
And so your work has been dedicated to helping recovering addicts have accessible information that can help them on their path to recovery. Is that correct?
It is correct, and there's more.
Okay.
So, you know, one of the things that happens in our culture is that we know a lot about addiction. We read about it in the newspaper. We hear it on the news. We see people who are in active addiction doing things that are, things that they don't end up being very proud of. And we don't hear about what happens when people recover and what happens when they move on in their lives. They begin a new type of life in recovery that is healthy and happy and whole, and that they, when they are in that spot, one of the things that community members can do is support them there. And so one of the things that I feel really passionately about is if we knew about recovery, if we knew how to support recovery, if we knew that there were 23 million people in recovery in this country, if we knew that, if we had all of that information, there would be things that we could do that we could really focus on to support the recovery community. So one of the things that does is it's the right thing to do, of course, and it also acts as overdose prevention or relapse prevention. So the stronger a person's recovery is, the less likely they are to go back into using. And the other thing is it builds our communities. So people in recovery have a lot to offer. They offer it, we just may not know it. And so I think sort of making that visible and letting people know exactly like, what can you do? That's what I'm really passionate about.
And your upcoming book, Second Chances, it's about that, isn't it? It's would you call it a tool for the community to be able to understand and support those in recovery?
Absolutely. So it'll be a very long to-do list for people in the community. So I'll tell you a little bit about sort of how I got to writing the book, because then you'll understand why it's a to-do list.
Okay.
So a few years ago, one of the pieces of work that I was doing was working with a bunch of young people in recovery to talk about recovery in Maine. So to go out to communities and schools and employers and talk about recovery, not about addiction, but talk about recovery. So these young people were, most of them were students at USM. They were totally fired up about their own recovery, about the opportunities that that had given them to just grow. And so I got fired up too, because they were really fun to work with, and we had a lot of good opportunities to be in the community. So one of the things that happened almost every time we were in the community is we'd be done with the presentation and kind of wrapping things up, and someone would invariably say, "So what can we do? What can we do to support what you were just talking about your recovery?" And so this is a book that answers that question. So if you're in a small town, if you're in a big town, I'm hoping that it goes beyond the borders of Maine. If you're in a rural area, that these are going to be some concrete things that you can do.
Because this is a case, as many, where it takes a community. You keep saying community, and I suspect, without having been able to have the pleasure of reading your book yet, that a key to a successful recovery has to also be rooted in the strength of a community.
Absolutely. So, a couple of things happen when people enter recovery. One is that often, not always, but often, they will build around themselves a community of others who are in recovery. And that is really important. So that peer support that goes on and on and on for years and years is very important. But the other thing that happens is they either they move back to the community where they were, or they never left, and they're in recovery in the community where they live and where they work. And what the people that I've interviewed for the book, what they've told me again and again, is that it is so important to have the community, to have them know that the community is supporting them in their efforts now to lead a different life. And so that has all kinds of ramifications for employers, for example. So employers who will not necessarily reject an application out of hand if there's a criminal record. Same thing for landlords. Making safe places where people can talk about recovery in workplaces is very important. So those types of things that are going to be super concrete, as I said, a to-do list that people can do. And these aren't things that I made up. They're things that people in recovery told me. And they're also things that are based in research. So recovery research is pretty young as a field, and we're learning as we go along. But there are some things that we do know that the research tells us will make a community what we could call recovery ready or recovery friendly, and that will just increase the chances that people in recovery can maintain and sustain long-term recovery.
So that they are accepted for who they are now and not for what they were addicted to in the past.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of stigma around drugs and drug use, but that stigma carries on into recovery. And so I think sometimes people feel like they just never left it behind. And that just has to stop. And so this is one way to kind of educate people about recovery. Like, stop thinking about the bad stuff and think about the good stuff.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much stigma around it. There's a sense of being ashamed, and there's a huge shaming that goes on. But then to know that they have to carry that with them, even though that's not who they are anymore. I'm so glad that you're doing this work.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can you talk about your writing process? Obviously, a lot of research went into this, a lot of conversations with both recovering addicts as well as, I would say, professionals in the area. Can you talk about that and just your writing process in general?
Sure. So I had a lot of foundational research through interviews that I had conducted in the work that I was doing earlier. And so I had a lot of sort of meat, and I also had a lot of contacts in the recovery community. And so I built on that and interviewed people really now with the intention of writing this book, and asking questions that were really specific to thinking about community. So I interviewed a lot of people, and they told me other people to interview and other people to interview. So there's this snowball effect. I've also interviewed people who are leading advocates nationally. They are remarkably accessible to talk about what they find are the needs of communities and the needs of people in recovery. And then I did research. So, articles, books, blogs, you name it. So that chunk of research, I would say, it's almost done. And the interviews really form the foundation of the work, of the book. The research sort of forms, is kind of added in to supplement but also bolster those arguments that people in recovery make. And then there's that, okay, now what do we do about it? So.
And what do you hope that this book will accomplish?
So there are two things that people in recovery have consistently told me when I have asked, so what would you like community members to do? What would be most helpful? Two things, there's a long list, but the two things that consistently come up are, first of all, the community members need to get educated about recovery, not about addiction, but about recovery. So learn about it, get to know some people in recovery, ask those questions that you always wanted to know. So that's the first thing. That's one thing this book will do, is educate people. And the second thing that people have said routinely is we really have to deal with stigma. And it really is people in the community that need to take that on. And so it's our responsibility as community members to accept people, as you said, as they are, not as they were, to just not even go there with shaming. And to change the language that we use and so forth. And so that's something else that this book will do. So both education and then showing people a different way to think about it, which the point is really to reduce that stigma.
And will it serve as a guide as to how to have those uncomfortable conversations?
There are guides out there for that.
Okay.
So probably I will reference those. There are so many resources now. There's so many resources, but we don't know that, right? We don't know where they are. So, so not that this will be one-stop shopping, but I can definitely sort of refer to those other resources.
And so among those other resources, you've been inspired by other authors, other writers?
Oh my goodness, there's so much written. There's so much written. There are people who write, from an academic point of view, who are really, really invested in the notion that the way our society is these days is conducive to people becoming addicted. And so, if you sort of put that process in reverse, so here we are. Culturally, where a lot of people feel very isolated. Addiction is a disease of isolation. Then let's reverse that and create connection. So that's one of the themes that runs across some of the books that I read. There are a lot of people who write about their own experiences, and then there's millions of articles, honestly, about the history of addiction, the history of treatment, the history of recovery, and so forth.
And so what makes yours unique is?
So this book, it takes a public health approach. It is specifically for community members, and it's also for professionals, so professionals who work in the community. And it is hands-on. It's just very practical. So far, I haven't seen a book like that.
That's great. So what advice do you have for someone who has a passion? Obviously, you're passionate about this, and they want to begin the journey of assembling a book, similar to what you're doing.
Well, so I think you hit the nail on the head with having a passion. I think writing a book takes a lot of time. It's a pretty frustrating process. It's easy to get discouraged. And if you're not passionate about it, if you're kind of interested but you're not really passionate, I think you'd probably give up. So the advice that I would offer is pick what you're passionate about, whatever that ends up being. And then one of the things that I did early on, so I developed a book proposal, and I had some help with someone who was an editor or who edited the work and helped me rephrase and reframe and make it sound like it should be convincing. And then I sent it out to presses. So I would say that getting that done initially is pretty important. You can keep working on the reading and working on the research and working on the writing, but it takes so long to get your proposal accepted then to get the manuscript done, then to get it actually published, that you really need to jumpstart that process by getting to the publishers or to the presses early.
And do you have a daily practice with writing? Do you approach this as, this is your 9-to-5 job writing? Is it just when inspiration calls?
It's not just when inspiration calls. That doesn't work. So I try to write every day. And I, some people set, a word count for themselves, 1,000 words every day.
Sure.
I don't do that. I tried and it was hopelessly unsuccessful. But I do, I set a goal of working on writing for 4 hours a day. And I do that in the morning. And I do it in the same place. I have a very quiet, very peaceful room in my house where I do it. I have a couple of little rituals that involve coffee and so forth. But I write the same time every day. And I make sure that time is productive, meaning if I'm not at a point where I need to be writing, I'm researching.
Okay.
And what I have found is that if you really have that discipline of writing, sometimes you write stuff that's really not very good. Mm-hmm. That's too bad, but it might be improved later on, or it might be something that you trash or what have you, but you're still engaged in the material and you're still writing.
Yeah, you're still showing up for your work.
Yeah, exactly. And then usually what I do in the afternoon is I interview, and so these days it's a Zoom interview. And then, I'll either directly transcribe or pull quotes from the interview. So I do that in the afternoon. It's a less intensive type of work. And then I read cookbooks at night to relax.
Oh, and so this interview, obviously, it's taking place in 2020. Your book is coming out in 2021. How has the current pandemic situation altered your work life, your writing life? You mentioned you're doing remote interviewing at this moment.
So first of all, I do want to give a shout out to North Atlantic Books.
Okay.
That will be the publisher. And I have a deadline in the spring to deliver a manuscript so that it will be published in the fall. And so my initial idea for this book was to get in the car, take a trip, start in Maine and go down the eastern seaboard and interview people, not so much people in recovery, but people who were professionals in the field. So advocates, treatment providers, people who train recovery coaches, long list. And I made it as far as Richmond, Virginia. And then that was March 13th when we all realized, wait, life is just going to change pretty dramatically. So I came back to Maine, and what the COVID-19 restrictions have meant for me is that I actually have more time to write. And I have found that people are as open to Zoom interviews as any other kind of interview. It's a little less satisfying, for me anyway, to be Zooming as opposed to be meeting someone in person. But that part hasn't changed. I would say, so I have more time, but the other thing that the pandemic presents, ironically, is a huge distraction. So because all of our learning now is happening online, workshops, webinars, conferences, this, that, and the other thing, there are so many things that I could be involved with to learn or to make presentations. And I have had to just shut that down because it's a huge distraction, takes up a lot of time, and I just have to stop doing that. So those are the ways that the pandemic has affected me.
So you have a discipline to be able to.
Have to.
So can you, the idea of your book, as you mentioned, a lot of people will write from the aspect of having been in recovery. So they talk about that story. Others will write about the professional side of it. And yours seems to be emerging of both.
It's professional from that public health standpoint and just from, really digging into the research, which I think a lot of people don't realize that, there's research around some of this stuff. So it's that from the professional side. But, it's personal also. I have friends and family members who are in recovery. I have friends who've died from overdoses. I have friends and family members who are actively using. And, it's a reality for me, but it's a reality for most of us in the United States, unfortunately, these days. And so, yeah, it's a merging of sort of looking at what we know professionally with just adding a whole lot of heart to it, because it matters. It matters so much to so many people. So, yeah, it's not a personal story per se, but it's personal.
I get it.
Yeah.
So what is your greatest hope for this book and for those that it reaches?
Well, my greatest hope is that it's successful in the sells. I would like to see schools of public health adopt this book or parts of it, because so far, schools of public health, for the most part, deal with substance use prevention. They deal with access to treatment. They deal with types of treatment. They do not deal with recovery. So that's the professional side. And I would really like community members to, when they see it, to get to know the people that I interviewed the way I know them, to just like realize, oh my gosh, this is so great. This is wonderful. What a great thing. And, get inspired then to look at some of the tools in the book and see if there's something they might like to do in their community.
And I can see it being a mechanism to create a paradigm shift. First, a paradigm shift in, as you said, no longer stressing the addict, but stressing the recovered part of it. But also, if we can learn the skills as a community, as families and as a community, to talk about the taboo subjects, the hard things, to eliminate the shame that goes on, and to root out the underlying causes of why people turn to addiction, then hopefully we'll help create a place for this generation that exists to live happy lives, fulfilled. But then hopefully the next generations won't have to endure the same amount and perhaps not even become addicted. Is that is that just me thinking utopia?
It's utopia, but it's great.
Okay.
I mean, I do think some of the things that we do to create a recovery-friendly community has everything to do with community spirit, community involvement. We care for each other. And so what we do when we create a recovery-friendly community is we create a community that we all want to live in. So yeah, there could absolutely be a paradigm shift. And, we were sort of down that path before COVID hit. We were really talking more about recovery than addiction, and lots of things were changing. And then, things have kind of stalled. So that would be my hope for sure, that, we can pick up where we left off, and just get some energy around, supportive communities.
That sounds wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. Viewers can find your website at...
It's AlisonJonesWebb.com.
Web.com.
Pretty easy.
And we'll have all that information and more in the credits. And I look forward to seeing you again. Congratulations on your book.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.